I'm over here listening to Moi, Lolita by Alice because it's a completely wrong vibe for this video. Even before I get to Nabokov, please heed the content warnings. I'm going to warn you again once I get into the book, but please mind your own triggers and don't engage if you don't need to. Vladimir Nabokov was born 1891 in St. Petersburg in an incredibly noble and incredibly rich family. His grandfather was the Minister of Justice in Alexander II's court, his father the head of Constitutional Democratic Party, a well-known statesman and lawyer, and his mother was the heiress to a millionaire gold mine owner. The family was incredibly well off, and by Nabokov's recollections, his childhood was incredibly happy. The family was rather anglicized. The children spoke English before they could speak Russian, and the father only hired the Russian tutor when he realized that the children could barely speak Russian, but they also were taught French. The hobbies were also rather British: tennis, box, and chess. The children were also taught etiquette and all of these things that are expected of noblemen, and they somehow managed to install in them this haughtiness that is sometimes associated with English nobility. All of this made it difficult for Vladimir to fit in with his peers. He drove to school in a car when all of the kids took the tram or walked. I mean, look at this kid. The two passions of his adolescence were entomology and poetry. His father was the one who introduced Vladimir to the world of butterflies, and that's the passion that's going to stay with him until the very end. Poetry was also a big part of his life. He wrote his first poem at 15. He described it as a miracle when heart and paper became one. At 17, Vladimir inherited an estate and a multi-million fortune from his maternal uncle, which he didn't get to enjoy really because the October Revolution forced the family to flee the country. 1917, they fled from St. Petersburg to Crimea, and 1919, when Crimea was also taken over by the Bolsheviks, they took the last ship to Europe, leaving all of their fortune behind, but a few valuables and jewels, which would actually sustain them for a couple of years. The family first came to England. Vladimir got accepted into Cambridge, where he studied Russian and French literature after he quit zoology because he couldn't gut a live fish. After about a year in London, the family moved to Berlin, where Vladimir's father and a friend opened a magazine, Rul. Vladimir published his first works there under a pseudonym Vladimir Sirin. Sirin is derivative of siren. He believed that to be of significance. Vladimir stayed in Cambridge and would come with visits to Berlin from time to time, and during one of them, his father was killed by the Russian monarchists as he was shielding their party leader, Pavel Milukov. Father's death was a huge blow to Vladimir. He grew sullen and depressed. He was dating Svetlana Zivert at the time, so when he proposed to her, she accepted because, as she said, he was so down that it would have been unkind to reject him. She did break off the engagement later on because the family believed that a student couldn't very well provide for her. Vladimir was earning money at the time by translating. A famous translation of his was the Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, which he translated into Russian by adapting the English wordplay from Carroll into Russian. Somehow Alice became Anna. I don't know. After Cambridge, Vladimir installed himself in Berlin, the center of the Russian emigration at the time. And so during one of those meetings of the Russian emigration, he met Vera Slanin, a fellow linguist, and they got married in 1925. The first novel that brought him fame, Mashinka, or Mary, was published in 1926, and in the next few years he also wrote some of his famous Russian novels, such as Luzhin's Defense, sometimes translated as Defense, and Camera Obscura, Laughter in the Dark. 1937, the family was forced to leave Germany as the Nazi party was now in full control, and Vera was actually Jewish, so they first moved to France, but as France was also taken over by the Nazis, they took the last ship, Champlain ship, to America. While Nabokov gained some fame already in Europe, it has not brought him fortune. So when they first arrived in America, he took up various teaching positions, teaching mostly Russian lit. There is a famous series of lectures of his because he has a very particular take on some of the Russian classics. For example, he famously hated Dostoevsky. During 1940s, during the road trip, Nabokov wrote Lolita. Getting it published was a little bit of a challenge, but once it did, it brought fame and fortune to Nabokov. By some estimation, Lolita's success brought him about a fourth of the fortune that he'd left behind in Russia. In 1960, Nabokov, along with his wife, moved to Montreux in Switzerland, where he mostly occupied himself by doing translations. He famously translated Pushkin's Eugene Onegin and Lermontov's Hero of Our Time into English, and he also did his own translation of Lolita from English to Russian. 1977, as he was chasing butterflies, famous and his favorite hobby, in the mountains of Switzerland, he fell down a slope and he died soon after in the hospital. Obviously, Nabokov is most famous for Lolita, but his other novels are also worthy of a mention. He wrote 9 in Russian and 9 in English. He's also written short stories and poems. If you've ever read anything by Nabokov, you know he has a very particular style in the way that he uses language. It's almost like poetry in prose. Critics also like to analyze his text, finding new meanings every single time. So if you ever read anything by him, look up the analysis afterwards, even if you don't agree or don't see that particular reading. It's interesting to see how people who are passionate about his work actually do perceive him. And I'm going to do the same thing once we get into the analysis of Lolita. Now, please, 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 please heed the content warnings. We're going to be covering, at least mentioning, the topics of child abuse, child molesting, child grooming, rape, drugging, verbal, sexual, and physical abuse. If any of these are triggering to you, please make your own judgments and please don't proceed if you feel like you cannot. Nabokov started writing Lolita sometime in the 1940s. However, this idea of a child and an older man has already creeped up in some other works of his, for instance, The Gift and the Enchanter, but also Camera Obscura or Laughter in the Dark. Vladimir and his wife took up a road trip across America chasing butterflies, so Lolita was mostly written in cars and in motels. Nabokov had a weird habit of writing on small cardboard cards, each about 500 words, which he would later construct into a narrative and Vera would type out for him on a typewriter. After about 5+ years, Lolita was ready. The world was not ready, however. Nabokov started to pitch it to various editors in the US. None of them wanted anything to do with Lolita. And so finally Nabokov did find a publishing house willing to print Lolita. It was Olympia Press in France, which was specializing in pornographic/erotic novels, which Nabokov didn't know at the time. And it actually did some disservice to Lolita, I guess, because it was marketed now as a pornographic novel, which it truly isn't, and it brought some controversy to it. It was first published in France in 1955, and the first American publication saw the light in 1958. Lolita was originally written in English, but Nabokov did took up the translation into Russian himself, which he found difficult, actually. Not only is text riddled with Americanisms and English wordplay, but also innocent words such as cheerleader and jeans seem to pose a problem for him. He translated them using 10-word descriptions, when in reality Russia has already adapted the word jeans, for example. The Russian translation has slight changes, added and removed details, so it can actually be treated as a new edition of the book. It was obviously not published in the USSR at the time. It was published in Russian in America in 1968. It was first officially published in Russia in 1989. So this copy that I have here from 1991 is actually a pretty early edition of Lolita in Russia. To this day, Nabokov isn't part of the school program. Thank God for that. There are 2 movie adaptations of Lolita, the famous ones. One is Kubrick's one, which came out when Nabokov was still alive, and he famously was not happy with it. Apparently, Nabokov was approached to do the screenplay, and he anecdotally turned in something like 700-page script, and then something a little bit shorter, but still far too long to put to film. I have not made myself suffer through the movie adaptations, but I did watch the reviews on YouTube, and from what I understand, neither movie is actually a good substitute for the book. So Shall we get into the book? The book opens with a foreword from a psychology professor who's received a manuscript from a now dead man writing under the pseudonym Humbert Humbert. Written as a memoir, Humbert describes his life starting from his childhood. At around 13 years old, he fell in love with a girl named Annabelle, and they were interrupted trying to have sex for the first time, and Annabelle died soon after, and thus Humbert's obsession with young girls solidified. He calls them nymphets, girls aged 9 to 14, and he's sexually attracted to them. The story actually kicks in when Humbert moves to America and is offered to rent a room from a widow named Charlotte Hayes. He doesn't like Charlotte or the house, but then he sees Charlotte's 12-year-old daughter named Dolores, or affectionately called Dolly and Lo, and she strikingly resembles Annabelle, so he decides to move in. For quite some time, Humbert spends his time leering at Dolores, whom he calls Lolita in his head, masturbates to fantasies of her, the smallest physical contact gets him aroused, and all of this culminates in a scene where he rubs off on her when she puts her legs across his lap on the couch. Dolores soon after is sent off to a summer camp, and at the same time Charlotte confesses her feelings to Humbert. He's not interested in Charlotte as a woman, he finds her uninteresting and shallow, but he quickly realizes that a relationship with her would give him access to Dolly, so he proposes on the spot. They married while Dolly is still at summer camp, and Humbert starts to drug Charlotte with various sleeping solutions and sedatives, so once Dolly comes back from camp, he can drug both mother and daughter and molest his Lolita to his pleasure. In a month's time, Charlotte finds Humbert's diary, is terrified, confronts him, and when she runs off to send letters warning her friends of Humbert, she gets hit by a car. Humbert destroys the letters, buries the wife, breaks off all connections with their friends, and goes off to pick up Dolores from summer camp. He tells her that her mother is gravely sick and is hospitalized, and they need to go. He checks them into a hotel where he gives Dolores a sedative pill. While he works up the courage to go back to the hotel room where he expects Dolores to be asleep with the sedative, he meets a man in the shadows who seems to know what Humbert is up to. When he comes back to the room, he finds out that the sedative was mild and Dolores is merely drowsy, so he spends the night awake fantasizing about her. In the morning, while they're still in bed, Dolores asks him if he ever played the game that they used to play in camp and offers to show him. Thus, their first sexual encounter occurs. Afterwards, Dolores tells him about her first sexual experience that actually happened in camp a year prior with a female tent mate, but Humbert is obviously more interested in the heterosexual experience, so she tells him about a month-long relationship with a 13-year-old boy and a female friend that happened in camp the year prior. Once they leave the hotel and get into the car, Dolly is obviously in pain, she's irritable, she calls him names, tells him that she should have called the cops on him for what he's done to her, and asks for the number to call her mom. Only then does Humbert tell her that her mother is dead and she has nowhere to go. And so they continue the road trip across America, staying in hotels where he rapes her at least 3 times a day, expects sexual favors from her, bribes her when he wants her to do something that she doesn't like to do. He persuades her that she has nowhere to go, that if she were to go to the police, she would be the one blamed and would be sent off to an awful place. He's controlling, he monitors her every move, doesn't like her talking to strangers, to boys her age. He's verbally and sometimes physically abusive. Eventually, they settle in a town, Birdsley, where Humbert gets a professorial job and Dolores goes to a private school. He's still controlling and monitoring her every move, and only persuasion from the school principal, he allows Dolores to participate in the school play written by famous playwright Claire Quilty, which Dolores loves. The day before the premiere, Dolly and Humbert get into the fight. Dolores runs off. He finds her the same night in a cafe, and she suggests another road trip. As they travel, Humbert feels like he's being followed, and Dolly makes multiple attempts at escaping him. Eventually, somewhere in Colorado, Dolores falls ill with high fever and is hospitalized. Humbert stays in a nearby hotel and visits her, but one night he himself feels feverish and oozy, so he skips the visit. The next day, when he comes to visit, the hospital staff tells him that Dolores checked herself out and was picked up by an uncle. Humbert tries to chase after them, goes from motel to motel, hires a PI, but eventually gives up and believes that Dolores is lost to him forever. He returns to some version of life. He even gets into a relationship with an adult woman named Rita, but he's obviously very depressed. Then one day he receives a letter from Dolores asking for money. He tracks them down and finds her now 17 years old, married and pregnant. Her husband and she are planning to move to Alaska for his job. The man who took her was not her husband, though. It was Claire Quilty, the playwright, with whom she was madly in love with, but things didn't work out because she only wanted him, and his sexual preferences were even freakier than what she was used to. And so when she refused to participate in a porno of an orgy, he kicked her out. In that moment, Humbert believes that he now loves his Lolita with a pure love now and offers her to come away with him, but she refuses. So he gives her the money, signs off the inheritance that she was owned over to her, and goes to enact revenge on Claire Quilty. He finds him in a mansion, they talk, and he shoots him multiple times, and Humbert is arrested soon after. In the last chapters, Humbert asks for the story to be printed not only after his death, but Lolita's as well, since he believes that she would live a longer life than he, but we find out that she died in childbirth that same year. First and foremost, I tried to give you a rather clinical description of the events. All of the topics are present in the story in various levels of detail, so if any of the topics are triggering to you, please do not interact with the book. Nabokov does know how to craft a story and hide some details in flurry descriptions, so the text is truly not pornographic, but even the descriptions that he gives are revolting enough. I do not want to hear anything more about girls' panties, I tell you. And the main theme is very much the relationship between the pedophile and his victim, viewed through the eyes of the abuser. Now, it needs to be said that we're dealing with an unreliable narrator. We cannot take anything at face value that he says, and through the slip of tongue and general understanding of the situation, we can glean the true meaning and true events. Except I thought that the unreliable narrator works best if at any point in the story we actually trust him and get to sympathize with him. And then you reveal that we shouldn't have trusted him. There are two pieces of media that came after Lolita that I want to draw the comparison to. The Collector by John Fowles and the Netflix series You. Mild spoilers for both, I'm not going to reveal the ending though. Both treat us to an unreliable narrator through their inner monologue. In The Collector, you get to see the full deterioration of Frederick as he comes in contact with the object of his obsession and realizes that she's a real human being and not the idealized version that he's created in his head. And once you come to the end and see what he's become, you can look back and question whether you should have trusted anything he said in the beginning, especially if you're young and naive as I was when I first read the story and didn't see all the red flags in the beginning. Frederick is fleshed out beyond his obsession with Miranda. He seems like a weird dude with a few red flags about him in the beginning, but the full extent is not clear from the get-go. If you're so inclined, you can still feel for him, try to understand him, until the very end where he reveals himself fully. Joe in You shows his true colors pretty quickly. I think he kidnaps her ex like second episode. But the thing about Joe is that he believes himself to be the good guy. Every atrocious thing that he does it all for her. neither is present for Humbert. He never comes off as the good guy as Frederick does, nor does he believe himself to be like Joe does. From the get-go, he tells us about the obsession with little girls and how awful it is. Throughout the book, he would try to find feeble excuses in his adolescence, in Lolita, in society, but the framing remains. He's deplorable, but he just cannot help himself. Both Frederick and Joe do awful things, but they try to persuade us that it's warranted. So what is the purpose of the unreliable narrator in Lolita then? I know he's an awful person from the start. There's nothing he can say to dupe me into believing that this 12-year-old girl seduced him. I don't need him to slip up to understand that he manipulates her, controls her, and rapes her. I don't find his sob story in the beginning a justifiable excuse for what he does later, and seemingly he doesn't want me to be on his side. Even Dolores in the story calls it abuse. On multiple occasions she calls it rape, she calls him out on it, she calls him names. So even with Humbert telling the story, we get this perspective by the victim herself. But imagine for a second the same story, but we don't get his inner monologue from the start. Maybe you can start the story when he moves in with the widow and her daughter. The widow falls in love, they get married, she tragically dies, and he goes off to pick up the daughter like a good guy he is. And only then do you reveal he's a pedophile. You can even sprinkle clues in the beginning, but nothing definite, just a few red flags for us to watch out for. Arguably, you can even do this using first-person narration, it's just that he needs to hide it from us, the audience. Yes, it becomes a different genre, a horror or a criminal story, but that's a story. And a weird comparison, but I'm with Hitchcock on this one. Suspense is more impactful on the audience.
Now let's take the old-fashioned bomb theory. You and I are sitting talking, we'll say, about baseball. We're talking for 5 minutes. Suddenly a bomb goes off, and the audience have a 10-second terrible shock. Now, let's take the same situation. Tell the audience at the beginning that under the table, and show it to them, there's a bomb, and it's going to go off in 5 minutes. Now we talk baseball. What are the audience doing? They're saying, don't talk about baseball. There's a bomb under there. Get rid of it. But they're helpless. They can't jump out of their seats up onto the screen and grab hold of the bomb and throw it out. But one important factor. If you work the audience up to this degree, that bomb must never go off and kill anyone. Otherwise, they will be extremely angry with you.
What we have here is disgusting bombs going off all the time, where he describes his obsession with nymphets, and you want to throw up the entire time. And it never truly stops. You're shivering with disgust at every mention of girls' panties, their body parts, his reactions to it. So by the time he actually rapes Lolita, it's not as impactful. You're never truly desensitized to it, by the way. Every mention of it brought this disgusted look to my face, but it is too much. And as I said, it's truly not pornographic. Nabokov knows how to hide his meaning behind allegories and nice-sounding adjectives, but it's still too revolting. And honestly, I cannot stress enough how revolting and stomach-churning it really is. I'm not going to be reading out quotes here for your sake and mine, but it is too much. And even if we assume that the point is to show us how disgusting it is to lust after little girls, at some point it becomes like graphomania, this perverse thing, because you cannot look away. You are forced into this narrative that no sane person really wants to be in. And I'm honestly not interested if Lolita had a real-life prototype. Nabokov denied it. Critics speculate that he was heavily influenced by a real-life story of 11-year-old Sally Horner, who was kidnapped by Frank LaSalle, who drove her around the country for 2 years, passing her as his daughter and abusing and raping her. This story even gets a reference in the book. I'm a little bit concerned that this theme of little girls and older men creeps up in Nabokov's works. But there is no evidence to suggest that Nabokov had such tendencies, and he's dead now. What I am concerned about is the message. And it's a good time as any to say that Nabokov didn't seem to understand what he's written. Why did you write such a thing as Lolita? What did I do? I'm no messenger boy. If novel conveys some kind of moral, then God bless those who find it. When asked, Nabokov called Lolita his favorite novel, so that at least partially justifies my suffering through it, because I might as well just review his favorite novel. Now, I've read his interviews. There is a book called Think, Write, Speak that compiled, among other things, his interviews. I didn't mention it in his biography recap, but Nabokov comes off as a truly arrogant man. Maybe that's the aristocratic nobleman in him, but he comes off as incredibly arrogant man in an off-putting way, so I don't think we would have been friends. But back to the point. He's been asked multiple times if Lolita is satire, if it's social commentary, even if it's ethical to write such a thing as Lolita. And he's always shut down these questions, saying that he's an artist and this is a work of art. So if you want to derive meaning, you go for it, but he didn't put any in. The book has no message. I'm no messenger boy. A book has to stand on its own two feet, or fly on its two wings, or fall. I don't like this stance at all. It's all fine and dandy when you write a straightforward piece of media, or even a dividing one, but when you write such a controversial piece that has been misinterpreted during his lifetime, and to take such a stance is just cowardly. He couldn't have not known that the work is going to be controversial, that he's going to be asked about it, but he's acting like he's written Three Little Pigs and we're suddenly coming in with a gay subtext. There's accountability that comes with authorship. When you're putting a work into the world, especially if you've spent so much time trying to get it published, and now telling me that there is no message in a story like this, even if he's joking, it's not okay. What else is not okay? Nabokov framing the third part of the book as Humbert finally finds love. She's married with this poor lad, this Schiller, and at this moment Humbert understands that he loves her, and that this time it's real love. She's not pretty anymore, she's not graceful, she's going to have a baby, and it's now that he loves her. It's the great love scene. He says to her, "Leave your husband and come with me." And she doesn't understand. I'm okay with Humbert deluding himself into believing that he's finally in love with her, but when the author says it, I'm not fine with it. It's not even about him earning that love or how he comes to that realization, but on the meta level, what does it tell us? He wants me to empathize with Humbert without doing any of the legwork. Humbert seemingly comes to the realization that he's ruined this girl's life, but he's not truly apologizing either. He throws money at the problem and in the same breath asks Dolly to come away with him, so he doesn't understand after all. And yet, here we have the author who believes this to be a touching scene where I should have teared up. The good reader should have a little smarting at the corner of his eye when Humbert gives money to his Lolita, mature and with another. I don't have tears for Humbert, who needs to do so much more to make amends, to repay for the damage that he's caused, that even his ultimate imprisonment and death are not enough, even if Nabokov seems to think so. I have tears for Dolores. I have tears for her and her alone, since her fate has been sealed ever since this man has laid his eyes on her. Nabokov doesn't really understand her, what this experience would do to a girl. She wouldn't be calmly sitting with her abuser there. Nabokov seems to think that we only start to feel for her at the very end, when in reality, we start to feel for her from the very start. Also, an interesting piece here. Do you notice anything interesting about this quote here? You've been rather hard on Lolita. Yes, but she's also a very touching character. Toward the end of the book, the reader and the author pity her, this poor child who has been sacrificed on the altar of motels. It's very sad. She's married with this poor lad, this Schiller, and at this moment Humbert understands that he loves her and that this time it's real love. She's not pretty anymore, she's not graceful, she's going to have a baby, and it's now that he loves her. It's the great love scene. He says to her, "Leave your husband and come with me," and she doesn't understand. It's still his Lolita, and he loves her very tenderly, not with this morbid passion. Then she dies. Lolita is dead since the book is published, and that was the stipulation. All this cost me tears of blood. He starts talking about Lolita, but quickly shifts to Humbert's feelings. So even in his interviews, we only see Lolita through Humbert's eyes. How telling. To be fair, Nabokov admits that he knows nothing about little girls. Is there anything personal in your interest in little girls? My knowledge of nymphets is purely scholarly, I assure you. In fact, I don't much care for little girls. I have a 25-year-old son, so I'm probably better qualified to write about little boys. But his worst take of all is this one. The critics haven't understood very well that Lolita is at heart a tender work, suffused with a certain kindness. In the end, Humbert realizes that he has destroyed Lolita's childhood, and that makes him suffer. It's a work of pity. Humbert has confused morbid love and human love, and he has remorse. So he understands why he's writing the book. If that was the intent, Nabokov messed it up. The words are there in the text. Humbert says that he's ruined Lolita's childhood, but I don't feel it, I don't buy it. But more importantly, in what way, Mr. Nabokov, is this story kind or tender? How heartless and non-empathetic do you need to be to come out of this story feeling good and warm? Even if Humbert feels that remorse, which I don't buy, but even if he does, this doesn't even bring him to the basic human decency level. He's way below surface on that one. If you, Mr. Nabokov, wanted me to feel for him in the end, you should have framed the story differently. Maybe if Lolita overcame her experience, maybe if Humbert actually has gone through the events in his head and understood what he's done beyond this catch-all ruined her childhood, there needs to be a level of deconstruction here, so I don't see him just as a child abuser or rapist that he is. I've read dub-con and non-con stories before, and it's very easy to mess them up, but it's also very dangerous. These stories require meticulousness and care, but also, more importantly, the understanding of the purpose of the story. These stories, just as any other, require meaning and framing. And it can be anything. Safe fantasy roleplay? Yeah, you go for it. Social commentary? Yes. Cautionary? Go for it. Horror? Absolutely. But all of these can frame the same story in different ways to help us derive the meaning. Even if you want to leave your reader conflicted, that needs to be your intention and you frame it as such. I came out of the book not understanding the meaning of it, and having read Nabokov's take on it, I'm even more lost. Oh, and one last quote from Nabokov, just for funsies. Should there be co-education at high school? Young girls mature so much faster than boys. They become voluptuous and get into the habit of wearing tight woolen sweaters that make for enormous distraction. That just defeats the whole process of education. So why are we here? Since the author refused to add meaning, we need to do it for him. So is it to shine light on the problem of pedophilia? It worked out in a weird way because the first thing that pops up when you Google Lolita analysis is, you're reading it wrong. Lolita was not the one to seduce Humbert. You shouldn't trust him. He's an unreliable narrator. So that tells me that people are reading the story straight. As if Humbert is not a predator and was truly seduced by a little girl. I cannot imagine this reading like 50 years ago, much less now. Side note, I think the movies are partially to blame because I understand they leaned a little bit more on the Lolita seductress narrative, which is problematic, by the way, but still, when was consent invented yesterday? Honestly, at this point, his manipulations are so textbook, you can actually use this book as a reference to see how manipulations and abuse work. Look at this passage here. He quite openly uses manipulations, threats, bribes, monitors her every move, controls her behavior, is verbally and physically abusive, and it's all on top of him raping her consistently. If at any point in your life you read it as anything but abuser and his victim, I implore you to revisit and reconsider. Because the tactics of she was the one to blame, she came on to me, are still very much used to this day, so don't fall for that. The only one responsible is the abuser. Does this make the book still relevant to this day? Well, not really, because the stories that followed this one have done it better. There is a take that Nabokov wanted to shine a light on the problem of sexualization of young girls in the 30s and 40s, and I'm not willing to do any research whatsoever on whether or not it was a problem at the time. But what a weird way to do this, using a character like Humbert to do it. Because who is Humbert? When he's not talking about his obsession with little girls, Humbert believes himself to be a handsome, an intelligent, a charming person, all these adjectives, but I'm inclined to think that he's none of those things. He's probably an average Joe, he's just a narcissist. He's obviously controlling and abusive, but he's also very cowardly. We see this quite clearly in the scene where he briefly considers killing Charlotte Hayes when she threatens to send Dolores off to a boarding school, but he chickens out. It obviously comes back later when he's constantly afraid of being found out or of being followed on the way back. And the child molesting doesn't really help his case. And he seemingly doesn't exist outside of his obsession with little girls, even if we are treated to his every thought. And it's even harder to assess Dolores. We mostly view her through the eyes of Humbert, or her mother's through Humbert. And realistically, she's just a teen girl with a little bit of a teen rebellion thrown in that her mother calls being a brat. A lot of emphasis is drawn to her sexuality, which I'm not touching with a 10-foot pole. The only thing that we know about her other than that is that she enjoys acting and playing tennis. Humbert then laments that he shouldn't have allowed her to participate in the school play because that taught her how to lie to him. Even in the description in the third part, when she's married and with a child, we don't get to see much of who she is. And it's all because it doesn't really matter. There's nothing special about her beyond her passing resemblance to Humbert's childhood crush. She's just like any other girl. She could be any other girl. She's simply a tool through which we get to see Humbert. Her character doesn't matter. She could be the dumbest girl on earth or the future genius. The outcome is the same. She did nothing to bring on what Humbert has done to her. There is no fault of hers in any of this, no matter what Humbert may say. Would we have benefited if Dolores was more fleshed out? Well, yes and no. Yes, because it probably would have brought a little bit more sympathy from those who read it as a love story or Lolita Synopsis. Or maybe there is no saving for those people. And no, because the story is not truly hers, it's Humbert's. So leaving her this vague blob of curves and little personality only shines more light on the relationship that Humbert has with her. He obviously doesn't see her as a person, but a sexual object. But it also works against Nabokov's claim that in the end, Humbert actually falls in love with her because there is nothing for him to fall in love with. Humbert writes this story supposedly as he awaits his trial, so now he loves her with this pure love, so supposedly he could have added more humanizing details in the beginning, but instead he decides to treat her as a piece of meat. So what love, I ask you, Vladimir, what love? The only meaning and true purpose that this book serves is to give us an insight into this man's head, to show us how a pedophile and abuser thinks, how he gaslights his victim, how he tries to gaslight us into taking his side. And the worst thing is that he actually succeeds with at least part of the audience. Does this make it a book that everyone should read? If you're onto Humbert from the very start, then the only saving grace is Nabokov's language, because everything else is just by the numbers. Look at chapter 1 of the second part that I've quoted before. It's entirely built on his manipulations, and he fully admits to it. By rubbing all this in, I succeed in terrorizing Lo, who, despite a certain brash alertness of manner and spurts of wit, was not as intelligent a child as her IQ might suggest. But if I managed to establish that background of shared secrecy and shared guilt, I was not much less successful in keeping her in good mood. If you don't get who Humbert is from the start, then you truly need to engage with the text, pay close attention, and maybe look up additional materials on the topic, because the book doesn't seem to work in isolation. I don't believe in spoon-feeding the audience, but look at how Lolita is presented in pop culture, how she was adapted in movie form. Somehow, 70 years later, we're still missing the point, and so the problem is either with us or the story. And there's plenty wrong with both. Could Lolita be a dangerous, seductive influence on young readers? Does it destroy a taboo? There are questions that I don't like to answer, since basically there is no concern of mine. If my book, which of course is not written for children, nevertheless falls into their hands, they will surely soon set it down bored. And my grown men, who for one reason or another are attracted to adolescence, will be influenced by Lolita neither for good nor for evil. Every day things turn up in the press reporting dreadful sexual crimes against the young, in detail and vividly expressed. Children and adults read it. That was so before Lolita and will be no different in the future. Do I believe that reading Lolita will make you a pedophile? No, it doesn't work like that. But dismissing this concern is also not productive, because the sexualization of little girls is a problem, and in part it is Lolita's fault, even if people are just reading it wrong. Even if the book is considered to be a classic and there are people out there who believe it to be a masterpiece, we still need to think critically about the media that we consume and whether or not it really holds up, or it needs to come at least with a disclaimer. I've already mentioned one change that I believe would have made the story better in the beginning. And I also read a take by Alexander Dolinin. He is, I think, a Nabokov enthusiast, and he suggested a different reading of the ending. Unfortunately, it's not well supported in the text, but it's perfectly acceptable as a headcanon. We know that Lolita died at some point in Alaska, but imagine that Humbert lied about that. What if Lolita died in that hospital and everything after that is either a delusion by Humbert or revisionist history? It works somewhat, because after Lolita's disappearance, the tone of the story shifts. Humbert becomes almost a different character. He doesn't mention his obsession with little girls every other sentence. He develops a relationship with an adult woman. And when Lolita does actually reach out to him and he goes to find her, he appears to be almost magnanimous. He doesn't kill her or her husband on the spot, even if he's clutching the gun the entire time. He gives her the money that she needs and signs off the inheritance over to her and goes off to kill the man that's wronged him. Especially this scene with Dolores, it's very subdued. It's not a meeting between an abuser and his victim. She's even in a vulnerable position of the pregnancy, so she could be potentially at his mercy. Well, even if she's old now and not attractive to him anymore. But there is a wonderful passage earlier in the book where he contemplates Lolita aging and how she would bear his child, and then another young Lolita would be born, and then she would also give birth to a child, a girl, and so that would bring him nicely into his 60s, constantly having a young nymphette at his side. What I'm saying is the situation should be dangerous, but Humbert behaves out of character. He believes that it is not true love that he feels for his Lolita, and Nabokov suggests that we need to feel sympathy for him, that he's truly showing remorse. But it is a good time for us to remember that we're dealing with an unreliable narrator. All this back end of the book feels fake, especially the scene where he kills Claire Quilty. This mansion in the middle of nowhere, seemingly empty but not. This conversation that they have, it feels like a fever dream. He shoots Quilty multiple times while he continues to laugh and have conversation with him. And then there are people there who have not heard a thing. This scene feels off. But if we imagine for a second that Lolita died in that hospital, Humbert would have constructed this narrative that she was taken away from him. But he, the great and honorable Humbert, has forgiven her, given her the inheritance that was hers to begin with, big whoop, and avenged their separation, thus presenting himself as the good guy. And this take works better, in my opinion, than the truly remorseful and loving Humbert that Nabokov tries to shove down my throat. He's still creating a facade, he's still blameless in his own mind, while also being humble and taking some of the blame, but not really. We shouldn't trust him after all. I do know that my saying how controversial the text is might make you want to check it out. That's what brought the popularity to it in the first place. So I'm not going to tell you not to do it. Just keep in mind that the author didn't particularly seem to care about his reader, so proceed with caution.